The crisp November air bit at James Jim Callahan's weathered hands as he stepped out of his rusted pickup truck parked a block from the gleaming Chicago Veterans Museum. At 68, Jim carried the weight of his years not in his broad shoulders, but in the deep lines etched across his face, each one a silent testament to a life shaped by the jungles of Vietnam. He lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment in a working-class suburb, scraping by on a veteran's pension and the occasional handyman gig for neighbors. Jim wasn't one for talking much. His words were few, his memories locked tight in a heart that had seen too much. Under his bed, in a dented metal box, lay his most treasured possession, a bronze star, its edges dulled by time, nestled beside faded letters and a grainy photo of his old platoon, faces frozen in youth, some never making it home. Tonight was different. The museum was hosting its annual Salute to Valor Gala, a glitzy affair to honor veterans and unveil a new exhibit on the Vietnam War, a conflict that had carved Jim's soul into something both resilient and fragile. He hadn't planned to attend. Crowds and fanfare made him uneasy, like a fish flopping on dry land. But 6 weeks ago, Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the exhibit's curator, had tracked him down after a local VFW post mentioned his name. Over coffee at a greasy diner, Jim had reluctantly shared fragments of his story. Patrols through the Mekong Delta, the chaos of Tet, the weight of decisions no 19-year-old should make. Harper's eyes had lit up with academic fervor, scribbling notes, begging for details. A week later, a handwritten invitation arrived, its elegant script jarring against his chipped coffee mug. "Your presence is essential," it read. "This exhibit is for men like you." So here he was, in his best flannel shirt, pressed khakis, and a worn leather jacket that had seen him through decades of Chicago winters. It wasn't black tie, but it was all he had. Clutching the creased envelope, Jim approached the museum's towering glass doors, the warm glow within clashing with the cold night outside. The lobby buzzed with the city's elite, men in tailored tuxedos, women in sequined gowns, their laughter mingling with the clink of champagne flutes. Jim felt the weight of their world immediately, his scuffed boots out of place on the polished marble floor. At the check-in table stood a young man in a crisp suit, his name tag reading Tyler, Event Coordinator. Tyler's eyes flicked over Jim, pausing on the faded jacket, the gray stubble, the slight stoop of age. His smile, practiced and professional, faltered into something colder, more appraising. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his tone sharp enough to cut. Jim held out the envelope, his voice steady but soft. "James Callahan, I got an invitation from Dr. Harper." Tyler took the envelope with 2 fingers, as if it might stain his pristine cuffs. He glanced at it, then tapped rapidly on a tablet, his brow furrowing. "I'm not seeing a James Callahan on the primary guest list," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "This looks like a courtesy invite from Dr. Harper. Are you with the maintenance crew, or perhaps catering?" The words dripped with assumption, each syllable a jab at Jim's pride. Jim's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "No, sir. Dr. Harper invited me for the Vietnam exhibit. I helped with it." Tyler's lips curled into a skeptical smirk. "Right. Well, this is a black tie event, sir. The dress code is strict. Jacket and tie, minimum. That," he gestured at Jim's leather jacket, "doesn't cut it. We have standards to maintain." He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a patronizing whisper. "Frankly, you don't look like you belong here." The words landed like a sucker punch. Around them, a few guests turned, their eyes scanning Jim with a mix of curiosity and disdain. A woman in a glittering gown whispered to her companion, her pitying glance worse than any insult. Jim felt the familiar urge to shrink, to slip back into the shadows where he'd spent most of his life since Nam. But he stood his ground, the envelope crinkling in his grip. "The invitation doesn't mention a dress code," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the heat rising in his chest. "Dr. Harper asked me to be here." Tyler sighed, his patience theatrical. "Look, sir, I'm the event coordinator. My job is to enforce museum policy. Dr. Harper may have sent you a note, but rules are rules. You can't come in dressed like that." His voice grew sharper, louder, drawing more eyes. Please step aside. You're holding up the line." Jim didn't argue. He stepped back, his boots scuffing softly against the marble. He moved to the edge of the lobby, near a velvet rope blocking the main gallery. Through the glass doors, he caught glimpses of the exhibit, black and white photos of muddied jungles, display cases with dog tags and field gear, the low hum of guests marveling at sanitized relics of a brutal war. One photo, half visible, showed a group of GIs huddled in a rice paddy, their faces etched with exhaustion. Jim's throat tightened. He knew those faces, that fear, that mud. He stood there, a silent figure in a sea of wealth, invisible to the crowd gliding past with their champagne and small talk. Some glanced his way, curious about the old man in the outdated jacket. Others didn't notice him at all. Jim wasn't angry, not yet. He was tired, bone-deep tired, of a world that judged a man by his clothes rather than his scars. Dr. Harper had insisted he come, said his stories were the heart of the exhibit. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe he didn't belong here among these polished strangers in their curated version of his war. He considered leaving, slipping back to his quiet apartment, where the only judgment came from the creak of his old armchair. But something held him. A stubborn spark, a refusal to be erased. He adjusted his jacket, its leather warm against the lobby's chill, and decided to wait a few more minutes. Maybe Dr. Harper would show. If not, he'd go. No scene, no fight, just another quiet retreat into the life he'd always known. The Chicago Veterans Museum's lobby pulsed with the self-assured hum of privilege, the clink of champagne glasses a mocking counterpoint to the quiet ache in Jim Callahan's chest. He stood by the velvet rope, an outsider in a sea of sequins and silk, his worn leather jacket a stark contrast to the tuxedos gliding past. The envelope in his hand, Dr. Harper's handwritten invitation, felt heavier now, a fragile tether to a world that seemed determined to reject him. At 68, Jim was used to being invisible, but tonight the sting of Tyler's dismissal cut deeper, slicing open old wounds from a war that never truly left him. He could still see the Vietnam exhibit through the glass doors, its black and white photos whispering memories of mud-soaked nights and brothers lost. He was ready to leave, to fade back into the Chicago night when the museum's revolving doors spun with sudden force. A hush fell over the lobby as three figures entered, their presence commanding the room like a thunderclap. Two uniformed aides, their faces topped with military precision, flanked a man whose very stride seemed to demand respect. General William Bradley, a four-star legend of the U.S. Army, stood tall in his dress blues, the silver stars on his shoulders glinting under the chandeliers. His chest bore a tapestry of ribbons, each a story of valor, but his eyes, sharp, unyielding, told a deeper tale of battles fought and burdens carried. The guests of honor for the Salute to Valor Gala, Bradley was a name etched in military lore, a Vietnam commander whose leadership had turned the tide in hellish firefights. The museum director scurried forward, but Bradley's gaze cut through the crowd, past the glittering elite, and locked onto the lone figure by the velvet rope. Jim's breath caught. He hadn't seen Bill Bradley in decades, not since the Mekong Delta, where blood and courage had bound them tighter than brothers. The general's face, weathered but fierce, broke into a look of stunned recognition, then softened into something raw, reverence. Ignoring the director's outstretched hand, Bradley marched straight for Jim, his polished boots echoing like gunshots on the marble floor. The lobby froze, conversations died, champagne glasses hung mid-air. Tyler, the event coordinator, stiffened at his check-in table, sensing something seismic approaching. Bradley stopped before Jim, his posture rigid with purpose. Without a word, he snapped a crisp salute, his hand steady, his eyes locked on the man in the faded jacket. "Staff Sergeant Callahan," he said, his voice booming through the silent lobby. "It is a privilege to stand in your presence tonight." Jim, caught off guard, felt a tremor in his hands. Decades of instinct kicked in, and he returned the salute, his spine straightening despite the ache in his bones. "General Bradley," he replied, voice low but firm. "Didn't expect to see you here, sir." Bradley's stern features cracked into a warm, almost boyish grin. "Jim, you old dog, I heard you might show, but I didn't believe it. You never were one for the spotlight. His smile faded as he noticed Jim's position outside the gala, cordoned off like an afterthought. His brow furrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Why the hell are you out here by the ropes, Jim? You should be inside, front and center. This exhibit, he gestured toward the gallery, it's your story. The question hung like a guillotine. Jim glanced at Tyler, whose face had gone pale, then back at Bradley. Seems my jacket doesn't meet the evening standards, sir, he said simply, no trace of bitterness, just the weary truth. They say I don't belong. The air in the lobby seemed to thicken, charged with the weight of those words. Bradley's eyes darkened, a storm brewing behind them. He turned slowly, his four-star gaze pinning Tyler like a bug under glass. Who, he said, his voice low and lethal, dared to tell Staff Sergeant James Callahan he doesn't belong? Tyler stammered, his earlier confidence crumbling. General, sir, I didn't know who he was. His name wasn't on the main list in the dress code. Museum policy requires black tie, and his attire policy? Bradley's voice cut through like a bayonet. He took a step closer, towering over Tyler, who seemed to shrink. Let me tell you about this man's attire. He pointed at Jim's jacket, his words sharp enough to draw blood. This leather kept him alive through monsoons that drowned better men. Those lines on his face, earned in jungles you'd never survive, carrying the weight of this nation's freedom. This is Staff Sergeant James Callahan, the man who pulled me and 4 others out of a burning ambush in '68 under fire, with shrapnel in his leg. He refused medevac until every last man was safe. The crowd gasped, murmurs rippling through the elite. Eyes that had dismissed Jim now widened with shock, some with shame. Bradley's voice rose, each word a hammer blow. You stand here in your pressed suit, enforcing rules over a man who wrote the history you're pretending to honor. This exhibit, he jabbed a finger toward the gallery, those maps, those stories, they're his. He didn't just live that war, he bled for it. He's the standard, son, not your damn dress code. Tyler's face drained of color, his tablet trembling in his hands. The museum director, hovering nearby, looked like he might faint. Bradley wasn't done. He turned to the crowd, his voice thundering now, raw with righteous fury. This gala claims to honor heroes, yet you turn away a man whose courage built the freedom you take for granted. You value polish over sacrifice, image over soul. I've seen enough. He drew himself to his full height, his decision absolute. As guest of honor and on behalf of the United States Army, I declare this event over. The military delegation is leaving. I suggest you all think hard about what honor really means before you throw another party like this. A collective gasp swept the room. The director rushed forward, babbling apologies, but Bradley ignored him. He turned to Jim, his expression softening, eyes glistening with something close to tears. Staff Sergeant, let me escort you inside. There's an exhibit in there that belongs to you more than anyone. Jim hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. He nodded, his throat tight. Lead the way, sir. Bradley offered his arm, and the 2 aides snapped to attention, clearing a path. The crowd parted, some guests lowering their heads in shame, others staring in awe. Tyler stood frozen, his world unraveling as whispers of the general's words spread like wildfire. The honor guard at the entrance packed their colors, their movements sharp and final. Other military personnel slipped out, their exit a silent rebuke. The gala, moments ago a glittering spectacle, collapsed into stunned silence. Bradley led Jim into the Vietnam exhibit, where Dr. Elizabeth Harper rushed to meet them, her face pale with horror. Sergeant Callahan, General, I'm so sorry, she stammered. Tyler had no right. I had no idea. Jim raised a hand, his voice gentle but firm. It's done, ma'am. Let's see the exhibit. For the next hour, Jim walked through the gallery, flanked by the general and guided by Harper. They lingered at a display of maps Jim had sketched in the field, their faded lines now immortalized behind glass. A photo of a muddy patrol, faces haunted by fear, brought a lump to his throat. He pointed out details, a mislabeled river, a forgotten outpost, his voice soft but steady, unlocking memories he'd buried for decades. The general listened, his hand resting on Jim's shoulder, a silent vow of brotherhood. Outside, the gala's collapse hit the news like a bombshell. By morning, headlines screamed, "Four-star general shuts down gala over disrespect to Vietnam hero." Tyler was quietly fired, the museum issued a public apology, and donations flooded in for veteran programs. The exhibit drew record crowds, many asking about the sergeant whose story had upended a city's conscience. But for Jim, standing before a glass case holding a dog tag not unlike his own, the world's noise faded. He saw only the faces of his fallen brothers, felt the weight of their sacrifice. Bradley's voice broke the silence. "You didn't just survive that war, Jim. You carried us all through it." Jim's eyes glistened, a single tear falling as he whispered, "Just did my job, sir." In that moment, the museum's grandeur meant nothing, only the truth of their shared past and the honor that no dress code could ever define. The Chicago wind howled through the cracked window of Jim Callahan's one-bedroom apartment, carrying the faint hum of the city as winter tightened its grip. At 68, Jim sat in his worn armchair, the same one that had cradled him through countless sleepless nights, haunted by Vietnam's ghosts. The Bronze Star, once hidden in a dented box under his bed, now rested on a small shelf, its tarnished surface catching the dim glow of a single lamp. The headlines from the Salute to Valor Gala had faded, screaming banners about a four-star general shutting down a museum event over a disrespected hero, but their echo lingered in Jim's quiet life. He hadn't sought the spotlight, never wanted the news vans or the whispered awe of strangers at the corner diner, yet something had shifted in the weeks since that night, like a fault line moving beneath his world. The neighborhood saw him differently now. The bodega owner, who once nodded curtly, now slipped an extra coffee into Jim's bag, muttering, "For a real hero, man." Kids on the block, usually glued to their phones, paused to ask about Nam, their eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and reverence. At the local VFW post where Jim had once been just another face, weathered men in faded caps pulled him into their circle. Over lukewarm beers, they swapped stories of jungles and deserts, their laughter and silences knitting a camaraderie Jim hadn't felt since his platoon days. He didn't talk much, but when he did, about a patrol gone wrong in the Mekong or the buddy who never made it home, the room went quiet, every word landing like a sacred offering. General William Bradley became a fixture in Jim's life, a bond forged in war, rekindled in peace. The four-star legend, now retired but no less imposing, showed up unannounced at Jim's apartment, his polished boots absurd against the chipped linoleum floor. They'd sit for hours, coffee mugs steaming, talking about everything and nothing, old missions, new aches, the Cubs' latest loss. One evening, Bradley leaned back, his eyes tracing the Bronze Star on the shelf. "You know, Jim," he said, voice low, "that night at the museum wasn't just about you. It was about every soldier who's been forgotten, every sacrifice buried under someone else's rules. You reminded them what honor costs." Jim stared out the window, the city's lights blurring through the frost. "People forget, Bill," he said softly. "It's easier to shine up a medal than to look at the blood behind it." Bradley nodded, his silence heavy with shared truth. Their friendship, rooted in the mud of 68, grew into a lifeline, a reminder that some wounds heal best in the presence of those who understand. The Chicago Veterans Museum, stunned by the gala's collapse, transformed in the aftermath. Attendance surged, especially for the Vietnam exhibit, where visitors lingered at Jim's field sketches, now labeled with his name, Staff Sergeant James Callahan, survivor of Tet Offensive. Docent shared his story, how he dragged wounded men through gunfire, how his map shaped history, turning him into a quiet legend. The museum board, scrambling to save face, launched veteran outreach programs funded by donations that poured in after the scandal. They invited Jim back for a private ceremony offering a polished plaque and a public apology. He went, not for the fanfare, but to stand before the exhibit one more time, to see his brothers' faces in those grainy photos and whisper their names like a prayer. Yet beneath the newfound respect, a shadow lingered. Late at night, Jim would wake, heart pounding, the jungle screams clawing at his dreams. The gala had cracked open something raw, a reminder that the world's admiration came too late for the men he'd lost. He volunteered more at the VA hospital, sitting with younger vets, their eyes hollow from newer wars. He listened, his silence a balm, but each story chipped away at his own fragile peace. The city might call him a hero, but Jim felt like a man carrying ghosts, each one heavier than the last. One frigid morning, as Jim shoveled snow from his neighbor's stoop, a sleek black SUV pulled up, its tinted windows out of place in the gritty suburb. A young woman stepped out, her coat too expensive for the block, a notepad clutched in her gloved hands. "Mr. Callahan?" she asked, her voice crisp but nervous. "I'm Lauren Hayes with the Chicago Tribune. We're doing a follow-up on the gala incident. People want to know your story." Jim leaned on his shovel, his breath clouding in the air. "Ain't much to tell, ma'am," he said, his voice rough but kind. "I just did my job." Hayes pressed closer, undeterred. "But you're more than that. You're a symbol now. A reminder of what we owe our veterans. And we've heard rumors." Her voice dropped, eyes glinting with a journalist's hunger. "They say the museum's hiding something about that night. Something about the exhibit's funding. Did you know some of the donors were linked to defense contractors? People who profited from the war you fought?" Jim's grip tightened on the shovel, a chill unrelated to the snow creeping up his spine. He'd heard whispers at the VFW, grumblings about the gala's backers, about money tied to companies that built the choppers and bombs of his war. He'd dismissed it as bar talk, but Hayes' words struck a nerve. Was the exhibit, his exhibit, built on blood money? The thought twisted in his gut, a betrayal, sharper than Tyler's sneer. "I don't know about that," Jim said, his voice steady but his eyes distant. "You'd have to ask the museum." Hayes scribbled furiously, sensing a crack in his armor. "But you're the heart of this, Sergeant Callahan. If there's truth to these claims, don't you want to know? Don't you think the public deserves to—" Jim looked past her to the gray sky, heavy with coming snow. He thought of the men in those photos, their sacrifice reduced to glass cases funded by who knows what. He thought of Bradley, of the VFW, of the kids who now called him sir. And he thought of the envelope still tucked in his drawer. Dr. Harper's invitation, its elegant script now tinged with questions he hadn't dared ask. "I'll think on it," he said finally, turning back to the snow. Hayes nodded, handing him her card before climbing into the SUV. As it pulled away, Jim stood alone, the wind biting harder now. He didn't want to fight, didn't want the spotlight again. But the journalist's words clung to him, a challenge to the quiet life he'd reclaimed. If the exhibit, his story, his brother's story, was tainted, could he stay silent? Or would he have to step back into the fray, not for himself, but for the men who never came home? The snow fell thicker, blurring the world beyond his stoop. Jim shoveled on, each scrape of the blade a question unanswered, each breath a promise to the past. Whatever came next, he'd face it as he always had, alone, but unbroken, a soldier still marching toward an uncertain dawn